All right, Mr. Josh Gad stopping by USA Today. PictureFace Lizzy.
PictureFace Lizzy.
Children's book. Congrats on the children's book.
Thank you very much.
Why a children's book?
I have children, for starters.
Yep.
And during COVID, especially in the early days of COVID, I found that like parents needed an opportunity to have a moment to scream and just go outside for a second. And so early on, one day I don't know what happened. I just picked up some kids' books and I started reading to kids on Facebook Live and other platforms. And it took off. And during that time, I got familiar with the genre, fell in love with it, and then was like, you know what, one day I want to do this. And I was waiting for kind of the right idea to formulate. And like a lot of other parents out there, my kids are constantly asking for the latest in technology, specifically the latest in social media. So it's like, can we get TikTok? Can we get Snapchat? Can we get et cetera, et cetera? And it's always a battle. And they have a strong opinion, and I have a strong opinion. And so I decided to write a book about confronting those kind of conflicting viewpoints from the perspective of my children. And it's called PictureFace Lizzy because PictureFace Lizzy is essentially an American Girl doll meets an iPhone meets Snapchat. It's all things in one. And all of this kid's friends have this. And so she wants it, and she convinces her parents to get it. And her parents are like, okay, but don't lose the power of your imagination. Don't lose the power of living and looking around as opposed to always looking down. And over the course of the book, she gets one and she slowly starts to miss the things that she no longer does because she's all consumed by this. And I was concerned that my kids were going to be like, oh God, this is a way to lecture us in Helvetica type. And instead, they had me read it to them, loved it. And then the greatest was they asked me voluntarily to read it to their friends. And at that point, I knew that I had struck gold. I was like, okay, great.
Wow.
They accept this. They're like, they love it. We're good.
What do you think made it successful, at least in their eyes?
I think it successfully feels like it's not speaking down to, but it is elevating them up to kind of feel like they're not being lectured at. That they're, in the book, Liz, the kid Eve, gets a Lizzy, and she makes the decision to put it down, not the parents. And I think that's part of what I wanted this to be is I think it's very hard to protect your kids, for eternity, if not impossible. So at a certain point, you're going to have to make concessions. And I'm okay with that. But I want the kids to understand that they can be empowered by that which is such a superpower, which is their brain, right? I love nothing more than watching my kids sit down with toys and create a world. And the second they become so dependent on technology to do that work for them, I start to get worried that they're losing a bit of that innocence, a bit of that, self-sustained thinking and self-sustained imaginative play. And I want them to have that as long as they can. I know eventually it'll disappear.
Is the book a reflection of your parenting style? The way that you try to empower them?
I would say it's more of a reflection of my wife's parenting style than mine. I'm a sucker. The second they start crying, I tend to give in and then need a swift kick in the butt from my wife to sort of get back on team parents and be like, no, she's right. You're too young to have it. My wife is incredible about this stuff. She is so disciplined and really, really knows how to stick to her guns. I can be so manipulated by my girls. They have me wrapped around their finger, unfortunately.
It's just a good cop, bad cop routine, right?
It's a good cop, lazy cop.
Good cop, lazy
they definitely take advantage of this police force. Yeah.
You mentioned the seed was planted during COVID while everyone was locked down. And that kind of struck me. I mean, we saw you and heard you, I felt like a decent amount during that time, especially through your YouTube channel. Do you have any other things in the works from that time that like a creative seed that was planted that you're still like working on here in 2024 or will be in 2025?
Well, it's interesting. I have talked about, I did a series called Reunited Apart during that time that reunited some cast from my favorite movies of my childhood. And I've talked about maybe bringing that back in some capacity. We'll see. It's early days. But I think PictureFace Lizzy and my upcoming memoir in Gad We Trust, which is coming out in January, were truly byproducts of that time. It was a byproduct of me spending way too much time with myself and having a lot more to say than I thought I inherently did have to say. So I think all of it only exists because of that period. If not for that period, I don't know that I would have written as much as I have.
Are memoirs finished?
Memoir, I just put the finishing touches. It's coming out in January. And I describe it as therapy in front of a mirror. The amount of surprises that I discovered about myself during that process was really fascinating. By the way, all of this started because I used to write a column for USA Today. That's the only reason that I even got the bug to write long form. I used to do a column years ago, and the editor-in-chief reached out to me and was like, "We think you'd have a fun take on today's issues." So I wrote close to 10 columns for the publication.
Did you enjoy it?
Loved. I mean, it really, had it not been for that invitation and that opportunity, I don't think I would have thought to ever, write outside of screenwriting. So it was great. It was a real kind of nice discipline to learn on the fly.
As far as this children's book, there's also an audiobook component that Kristen Bell voices.
Yes.
And I'm sure some people, while they're happy to hear that Kristen's doing it, are like, well, wait, why didn't you just do it, Josh?
Thank you to all of those make-believe people who feel that way. I wanted to authentically get a female voice to represent Eve and the other girls. I think it's more authentic to the story, and Kristen plays a young girl better than I do. And I think she really resonated with the book, and she's got 2 little kids about my daughter's age or a little younger. And so it was just kind of kismet. It was a perfect opportunity to sort of team up with somebody who I absolutely adore.
And then just going back to the memoir for a second, you said you were discovering a lot about yourself. How were you journal? Did you go back into journals?
Everything.
Really?
I went back into journals. I did a lot. I had a lot of investigative, familial, introspection where I was, calling up loved ones and friends and revisiting things that I maybe didn't know about or things from my past. And it was eye-opening. It was really interesting and also cathartic in many ways, where I kind of put to bed some things that I maybe had never grappled with. And in January, everybody will know my deepest, darkest secrets.
Was there anything you had to hold back?
No pun intended. I'm a pretty open book when it comes to my life. I talk about my flaws ad nauseum. I wouldn't even call them flaws, but anxiety has been something that I've dealt with my whole life, and I'm very open about it. The divorce of my parents when I was about 5 years old is the reason that I'm now doing what I do. But it was a very difficult transition in my life. So there isn't much that I hold back, if anything, because I feel like if you're going to do this, then you got to rip the Band-Aid off.
But again, that it starts with we're all at home, and then you realize that you have something you want to say, and you have more that you want to write. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but then you also have the time to go back and talk
Yeah.
with certain people, right? Like that essentially provided you the time to do that. Otherwise, even if you had wanted to write a memoir, you may still be writing it right now because you would have been so busy.
No, in many ways, that was exactly the foundation for all of it. And it's funny because I started the memoir, but didn't realize what the memoir was about until like 5 months into the process, because it just certain things started to reveal themselves that shifted the perspective of the story I wanted to tell.
Want to talk about a few other things real quick. I just saw at the Emmys John Leguizamo, and I was joking with him about the news he made regarding Ice Age 6, and he immediately was like, yeah, they sent me a cease and desist. I wish they would have sent me that before I talked about it as opposed to after. Did you get one of those two things too, Mr. Leguizamo, or
Not
no?
only did I not get a cease and desist, I didn't even get a heads up that Frozen 3 and 4 were happening until after they announced it publicly. I wish I had been tipped off. They knew not to bother because I would pull a Leguizamo. But it's amazing. They announced it at D23, and I guess it's in the very nascent stages. But from what I understand, it's going to be pretty incredible, pretty epic, and I think an incredible continuation of a beloved story at this point.
Last time you were on Broadway here in New York, you were in the James Earl Jones Theater. Did you ever have a chance to meet him?
I did. I was fortunate enough to meet James in 2010, 2011, when he came to see Book of Mormon. And he was lovely enough to come backstage, spend some time with me and my co-stars Andrew Rannells, Roy O'Malley, Nikki James, and the rest of the cast. And we had an amazing conversation. He was delighted by the show. And then, strangely enough, I saw him for the first time when I was around 14 years old. He came and spoke at a, I don't know what the format was, but basically we went as part of my school to go see him speak, and he talked about his stutter, and he talked about his childhood, and he talked about some of the adversity he had to face. And that was actually the first time I ever met him, was when I was like 13 years old.
And that message must have resonated with you.
Oh, it did. Oh, it absolutely did. It's incredible to think that, like, perhaps the most iconic voice of a generation had to contend with, a stutter for most of his life. I just think it's, talk about mind over matter, and when you really put your mind to something, what you can achieve. And the fact that he dealt with his stutter his whole life and yet was willing to put himself out there on stage where you can't edit, and you go out and you do it, and he's a legend. And I'm grateful to have performed my last show in his namesake.
Something that, one of the stories that came about when he passed away was that his first Star Wars that he voiced it in like 2.5 hours. And I'm thinking, like, in 2024, like, if you were to sit down and voice a character for an upcoming Star Wars or any film, would it be done in 2.5? Like, what would that take in this day and age? Like,
No. But you know what? I think that, like, that was also a byproduct of a different time in which it was like, fun and gun filmmaking. Like, it was if you think about where George Lucas came from, he was very much of that independent, generation, like Coppola, Spielberg, all of those guys who were used to making films on a very tight schedule and a very tight budget. So I think he was probably applying that to Star Wars as well, because they didn't have, the kinds of inflated budgets that we have today. And so I kind of love that, like, that they had to work under that pressure, and think about how insanely iconic his performance is, given the fact that he only did it in 2.5 hours.
Yeah, mind-blowing to me, amongst other things, for sure. I had mentioned that you did have a little bit of a run there on The Daily Show. They've had a kind of a rotating cast of hosts and correspondents this year in an election year. Did they reach out to you at all to see if you were interested in anything? And did you tell them, no, I'm not moving to New York for you again? Sorry.
No, they don't need me. They're great. Now that John is back, all is right in the world. Trevor is also a tour de force, and when he left, I kept saying to myself, what are they gonna do now? And it makes my heart soar to have John on even once a week. And it's just great to see my old friend back in the chair where he belongs.
And then just going back to PictureFace Lizzy, did you talk with other parents about this story? Maybe when you did the readings for your kids' friends?
Yeah, I think a lot of parents find themselves in the same boat that I do, that we all do, which is technology is evolving faster than humanity. And adults are having a hard time navigating this space. So imagine being 12 or 10 and having to deal with the same kind of stress, the same kind of anxiety, the same kind of nuance that is not very present in, being on these platforms, right? It requires a lot. It requires a lot emotionally and mentally to navigate these landmines. And I think that it's a conversation that, unfortunately, we find ourselves in silos having to deal with it independently with our own children. But in writing this book, it was a great opportunity to sort of open up the conversation and ask other parents how they deal with saying no, or do they say yes? And if they say yes, do they have limitations? Is there a right way and a wrong way? Is there an opportunity to find a happy balance? I think there is, but I think we need to have that conversation. So that's what I hope PictureFace Lizzy at least affords families, to sit down and talk about it.
Did you learn anything from those conversations?
I did. I mean, so by writing the book from the perspective of a girl who is in between the ages of my own daughters, I was weirdly able to put myself in their shoes and understand the effect of hearing no and pushing back and saying, but what if? And then also trying to put myself in their shoes, but also marrying their shoes to, my own children's shoes and growing up in the 80s when we had, bicycles to entertain us and early, 8-bit Nintendo and not much else, right? Like, it was imagination or bust. So it's very interesting to me that a show like Stranger Things is so appealing to that demographic, because I think that in a way they romanticize and long for an analog world that doesn't exist. I think that they inherently know that this is stressful. And I think they wish that they had less of this and more of just an opportunity to sit in a room and play pretend. And so I hope that this book inspires that. I'm not sure if it will, but it's a conversation starter at the very least.
I was thinking about that too. Like, I was born in '85, so yeah, like I remember like the first Nintendo and obviously Super Nintendo. But the conversation was always like, now what the kids would say, they'd say, "Go touch grass," or "You need to touch grass." Like, go outside and play. Like, don't sit in front of the TV playing video games. And now with these devices, they could be anywhere plugged in. So it's like it brings up this whole new set of challenges on top of, obviously, they're not just playing a video game on there. There's so many other things they could see.
No, there's too much. Yeah. There's too much. And it's a continuous barrage of new stuff. And now with AI, it's going to get that much harder to put these devices down because, why when they can solve any problem for you? So I long for a simpler time, but I also know I'm not naive. And I understand that it's part of the world the evolving world that they're living in. But I hope to strike a balance. I hope that they can be inspired enough to be like, you know what? I have this, but I can afford to put it down. And I want to, not because I'm on the clock with my parents, but because I'm a little tired of it and I don't need to constantly answer to it. I can have my own, free thinking, in my own kind of bubble where I can just be myself, just a kid.